Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Transportation and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee, our first budget hearing of the 2022 legislative session, and starting with a really important topic for all Marylanders, the Chesapeake Bay fiscal 2023 budget overview. And we will start with our Department of Legislative Services analyst to take us through the analysis, Andrew Gray. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You should be seeing the overall budget for Chesapeake Bay Restoration on your screen now. This reflects a substantial decrease from fiscal 22, around a $542.1 million decrease, and this largely reflects the timing of Purple Line activities. So it does not reflect an overall change in Chesapeake Bay Restoration activities, but largely an administrative aspect of the Purple Line. In terms of the overall picture for Chesapeake Bay Restoration, the total maximum daily load, or TMDL, is sort of the Bay diet for nutrients and sediment, the nutrients, phosphorus, and nitrogen and sediment. And the Exhibit 1 reflects here the final target pollution loads for Maryland's major basins, 45.8 million pounds for nitrogen pollution, 3.7 million pounds for phosphorus, and 8,342, well, a lot more for sediment pollution, let's put it that way. So the overall process for the total maximum daily load is for the states to have watershed implementation plans, which are their actions to then get to that diet by 2025. And those actions then are broken down into 2-year milestones, and that allows for more accountability as the process progresses. Exhibit 2 reflects here the Bay Restoration maps. This is information through 2019. We do not provide the 2020 data because they're still working on the Chesapeake Assessment and Scenario Tool models to kind of provide for the synthesizing of the data. But what you see here up through 2019 is on the far left, the agriculture is the primary loading sector in the watershed, and that's all the green that you're seeing in the far left. In the middle component of the exhibit is the reduction progress of nitrogen. And what you're seeing here is sort of spotty progress. The darker colors reflect higher levels, and the blue actually reflecting a actual completion of the target loads for particular land river segments. And therefore, we have not seen as much progress as we need to going forward. And on the far right is the nitrogen loading reduction that remains. And what you're largely seeing here in the heavy purple is the Shenandoah River Valley, the Lancaster area of Pennsylvania, and north as well, kind of agricultural region. And then the eastern shore of Maryland as being the kind of large areas where nitrogen loading still is required to occur. And that's also along some of the wastewater treatment plants as well. In terms of Maryland's nitrogen loads, Exhibit 4 reflects our progress to date through 2020. The most recent data available reflects that between 2019 and 2020, around 4.1 million pounds of nitrogen were removed from the state's waterways. And that means that we are closer and on target to meet that 2025 target of 45.8 million pounds. However, we'll note here that the Maryland's plan is no longer does not have as much of a comfort factor as originally intended. The current plan will get us to around 45.5 million pounds of nitrogen, which is just under our target. So any kind of leeway we no longer have with the cushion we had previously. In terms of the work that needs to be done by sector, just highlight here that the agriculture sector really does need to step up the reductions between 2020 and 25. That's a 6.5% reduction in loads between 2009 and 2020, but they're going to need to be up to an 18.5% reduction in loads moving forward. In terms of the nitrogen loads by basin, just highlight here that the Western Shore at the very bottom has done a tremendous job in terms of the reductions, and that's largely due to the upgrade of the wastewater treatment plants in Maryland to enhance nutrient removal technology. The Eastern Shore still needs to do a certain amount of work, and they're going to have to ramp up quite a bit from the 7.4% reduction between the 2009-2020 period to 12.1% reduction moving forward from the 2020 to 2025 period. Then Chesapeake Bay loads across all the different states. The overall target is 199 million pounds, and the plans as proposed at this point do not actually reach that target. And then an additional challenge is that Pennsylvania has quite a bit more to do in order to be able to even get to its load reductions. It needs to step up to about 21.4% reduction between 2020 and 2025. they'll be discussed more as an issue in this analysis. First issue here concerns the private conservation financing. So the administration put out a letter in October 2021 reflecting support for the actions in Senate Bill 737. This is the private conservation financing bill. This bill has been reintroduced in the 2022 session as Senate Bill 348 and House Bill 653. The idea here is really to kind of provide for more private investment for state environmental projects and markets, and really focus on pay for performance procurement in order really to get the most bang for the buck. A report was released in May 2021 by the Environmental Policy Innovation Center and Chesapeake Conservancy. It really highlighted some of the benefits from a private conservation financing approach. 4 of those kind of highlighted components are noted at the bottom of page 20. Procurement was one of the major ones. This is the kind of moving to environmental outcomes paying. So instead of the state taking on the risk for projects, private entities would take on the risk by doing a project, and they would seek reimbursement from the state based on the proof that the outcomes were being achieved. And that way, the state is not just paying for practices, it's actually paying for certain outcomes. Green infrastructure evaluations, the idea of really kind of valuing natural capital and green infrastructure at the basic, at the base level, putting the state and local budgeting, zoning decisions and offset policies as well, really kind of embedded in the process. Public-private partnerships, or P3s, another major component of the recommendations. One of the considerations here was Prince George's County stormwater collaboration with Corvia Solutions. However, there have been some concerns, as we'll discuss a little bit more. Consent decree is in effect in Prince George's County because they have not met the municipal separate storm sewer system permit requirements for remediation of stormwater. Then finally, environmental impact offsetting. The idea here is to allow private companies to really engage in the process instead of the state. Concern here is that funding is not, one provided for offsets, is not then used expeditiously in terms of making sure it's moved to projects can really help out with the environmental outcomes that we're looking for. The Department of Legislative Services recommends the administration discuss the possibility of a final component, which is an outcome-based payment system for the cover crop program, due to the consideration by the Soil Health Advisory Committee of potentially moving to a 5-year outcome-based cover crop program, which could potentially be side by side with the annual program and would pay for outcomes over a 5-year period. Second issue concerns the overall Chesapeake Bay Restoration funding. You've seen this exhibit in a slightly different form at the very beginning of this presentation. Basic idea is that there's a large decrease in funding for the purple line activities due to the timing of when they're expected to occur. Not that they're not going to occur, but they're just shifting out the timeline for that project. In terms of other activities, there are increases here for Program Open Space, Rural Legacy, and Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation. This reflects the increased transfer tax revenue. This is the overattainment money in the additional revenue estimated funding for fiscal 23, as well as there's funding coming in from transfer tax repayment funding as well. So a lot of money coming in for transfer tax related conservation programs. And then in terms of the Department of Natural Resources, there's around $13.8 million or so for, or the 13.4 million increase for oyster restoration. That will help Chesapeake Bay in terms of providing for more filtering of the waters or for nutrients and sediment. And then while not highlighted in this exhibit, the Maryland Department of the Environment does have $25 million in its budget in general obligation bonds for the Conowingo Dam watershed implementation plan to help facilitate meeting those goals through that separate watershed implementation plan. And there's $6 million in the governor's budget in general obligation bonds for dredging the Conowingo Dam as well. And that's reflected in the Maryland Environmental Services budget. In terms of a recommendation here, DLS recommends the addition of community narrative to continue to request this information, and then the possible inclusion of budget bill language to restrict funding until the submission of the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay 2010 Trust Fund report, which has not been received to date. In terms of issue number 3, this is historical and projected Chesapeake Bay restoration spending. So funding is restricted in 5 different agencies for submission and pending the submission of a report on historical and projected Chesapeake Bay restoration funding. I'd just like to highlight kind of 2 main considerations here in terms of short-term impacts and long-term impacts on the total maximum daily load progress in Maryland is made. Short-term impacts reflect the concerns that with wastewater treatment plant failures have had in recent months. The Patapsco and Back River wastewater treatment plants, due to operations and structural problems, have had basically a regression in progress. They've been actually increasing their loads due to nutrients and sediment that have not been treated through those wastewater treatment plants. The Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper has filed a lawsuit, and the Maryland Department of Environment recently filed a lawsuit as well to address these concerns. This is really a concern because wastewater treatment plants are the primary way Maryland has been getting to the total maximum daily load. So to have this sector have major problems with two of its major wastewater treatment plants is a concern. It shows kind of the risk of having too many eggs in one basket. Conowingo Dam is another kind of short-term question. This is the Conowingo Dam Watershed Implementation Plan. The idea here is for the states to work together to reduce the loads reflected by the Conowingo Dam. This is the nutrients and sediment that are attributable to the dam that are behind it in a sense. The idea is for the states to work together on a financing agreement to be able to pay for those reductions. The question is who's going to make sure the funding is there first. Maryland is putting $25 million for that purpose. Question is, will the other states provide that funding as well? And what will that original final financing strategy look like when everybody's put their funding in place? In terms of long-term impacts, just like to focus on stormwater and the septic sector. Concern here is wastewater treatment plants will grow in terms of population over time, even though it might be a little lower due to the pandemic and also just kind of demographic shifts. There's growth will then require additional reductions in stormwater and septic sectors. That means that there's going to be a tremendous amount of additional funding needed in the stormwater sector because the practices are very expensive. And there's also the concern that, once again, Corvius Solutions is one of the kind of highlighted public-private partnerships in this project with Prince George's County has not brought to fruition the kind of reductions in the stormwater work that was hoped for. And therefore, the Maryland Department of Environment has instituted a consent decree there to address the concerns with the lack of progress in terms of their Maryland, the MS4 permit. And then finally, just like to highlight, climate change is a big concern for all the states, with more potential rain coming our way, and then also the patchiness of that rain, kind of high velocity falls. There's the concern that there needs to be additional reductions in order to maintain the total maximum daily load. Maryland Department of the Environment has submitted an environmental an addendum to its watershed implementation plan to address climate change, but it looks to really be incentivizing wastewater treatment plants to do additional work. And obviously, if the wastewater treatment plants are having trouble meeting their current obligations, then that may not necessarily come to fruition. GLS recommends the administration comments plans to deal with the short-term impacts of Patapsco and Back River wastewater treatment plant failures, Conowingo Dam implementation, long-term impacts of growth in stormwater and septic sector nutrient sediment loadings, and finally on climate change. And DLS also recommends that language be included to continue that reporting on historical and projected Chesapeake Bay restoration spending. Moving now to the fourth issue, this concerns the Conowingo Dam. So as discussed, the Conowingo Dam, a major best management practice in a sense, it's been holding back the nutrients and sediment behind it for years now, but unfortunately it's reached capacity. There's now a Conowingo Dam watershed implementation plan, and it could cost somewhere between $53 million to $253 million per year into the future for the best management practices that are needed to reduce the 6 million to 6.75 million pounds of nitrogen that need to be reduced for that watershed implementation plan. The agency administration, has $25 million in its budget for that purpose. And the question is whether the other states will provide funding as well. The dam has been relicensed, but there are relicensing concerns. The lawsuits have been enjoined to challenge the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's relicensing of the dam. And the Attorney General, my understanding, is kind of stepped in on those lawsuits. And finally, in terms of the sediment behind the dam, there was a sediment beneficial reuse study that was conducted by the administration. They are now looking to have a report completed by summer of 2022, reflecting kind of what the impacts of that dredging and innovative reuse proposal look like. And there's $6 million in Maryland Environmental Services budget, once again, for the purposes of dredging in fiscal 2023. DLS recommends that the administration comment on the likelihood that funding will be provided for the Conowingo Dam watershed implementation plan, status of the Conowingo Dam relicensing, including those legal challenges, and any preliminary findings from the pilot dredging and sediment characterization studies. Finally, issue 5 reflects the lawsuits been filed against the Environmental Protection Agency, largely due to the progress or lack of progress in New York and Pennsylvania. So those lawsuits have been consolidated. In the meantime, Pennsylvania submitted an amendment to its Phase 3 watershed implementation plan recently, as of December 31st, 2021. It appears at first to address the concerns with its lack of progress towards the total maximum daily load and its implementing its watershed implementation plan. But largely those the reductions that they're proposing appear to be reaching back years to practices that were implemented. The Chesapeake Bay program no longer considered as viable. So then the question really is, can anybody prove that those practices are still doing the work they're supposed to be doing? DLS recommends that the administration comment on the President Joseph R. Biden Jr. administration's plans for regulatory oversight of the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, given the concerns about the progress about Pennsylvania has had. The recommended action is to restrict funding in Department of Planning, Natural Resources, Agriculture, Environment, and Budget and Management until the historical and Chesapeake Bay Restoration funding report is provided to the legislature. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Andrew. If my colleagues have questions, please use the raise hand function. In a second. While they're doing that, let me thank Cherie and Ken for being our technical and staff support for this online hearing. Delegate Vitessel. Got to unmute. Delegate Vitessel, you're still on mute.
I got you. All right, my one. Okay, fine. Andrew, on the Conowingo Dam, you reported there that there's a need for Exxon to come up with like $200 million in payment to address these issues that they have with the dam. Any idea what amount of revenue they generate from making power at that dam?
I do not have the specific information about how much revenue. I believe it's somewhere between $50 and $100 million was the revenue. The $200 million settlement is over a 50-year period, though.
Oh, okay. It's not an annual. It's not an annual.
Correct. No, that would have been ideal, but that did not occur.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Okay, we have a murderer's row of cabinet secretaries from the administration. I will introduce the sort of leads for each department and leave it to them to introduce whoever on their team will be involved. We have Secretary McCord from the Department of Planning, Secretary Hadaway-Riccio from the Department of Natural Resources, Secretary Grumbles from the Maryland Department of the Environment, and representing the Department of Agriculture, Assistant Secretary Hans Schmidt. The Secretary had informed me last week that he had a conflict on time, so appreciate Assistant Secretary Schmidt stepping in. With that, I'll turn it over to the administration to order your comments as you see fit. Sounds like Secretary Grumbles is seizing the microphone. So after you, Mr. Secretary.
I am seizing it, and if I I seem to have an unstable internet connection. So if I drop the microphone, I know Secretary Hadaway-Riccio can pick it up. But I'm joined, as you said, by some of the members of the governor's Chesapeake Bay cabinet. We focus on working together and reaching out to other agencies and public and private sector entities and the other states that are part of the 6-state Chesapeake Bay watershed to make real progress. And Mr. Chairman, it's a real honor to appear before you and members of the subcommittee. Extremely high priority for the Hogan administration to live up to our commitments and to lead in the race to restore and protect the Chesapeake Bay. I'm just going to say a few opening remarks about some of the very important themes that Andrew Gray touched upon, the progress we're making, the fact that we have much work to do, and that requires partnerships with you all and with others, and not just in the public sector, but in the private sector. One of the most important messages of this briefing to members of the subcommittee is that there are many different indicators for progress for a healthy and resilient Chesapeake Bay. One of the most important is clean water, and for us as a state to live up to our commitments to reach what we committed to in our Phase 3 WIP for the 2025 goal in the Clean Water Act, TMDL, the pollution budget. And not only that, but to ensure that other states and federal entities do their fair share. So we are making progress, but as was indicated in the DLS analysis, it's always a combination of anticipated growth, which can be very good, but how do we account for that growth? And then the two other really important variables that administration to administration at the federal level have recognized, and those are climate change and the Conowingo Dam factor, the Susquehanna River pollution. So we're committed to making real progress on all of those. We're also focusing on ensuring that Pennsylvania and New York do what they had committed to doing. And I'll speak more to that later, but that's in litigation with EPA, and we're hoping to make progress on that soon now that the EPA political leadership is in place and the state of Maryland as a lead player in that lawsuit with Virginia and Delaware and the District of Columbia against EPA for not being as strong enough as they should be as an interstate umpire for the phase 3 WIP and the commitments. But also I just wanted to emphasize that our key strategies focus on not only education and conservation stewardship and planning, but also focus on using our regulatory tools, our infrastructure funding, and our partnerships at the federal level. But it's always locally based. What can we achieve, and how can we continue to use science to get there in a sustainable and durable way, and a balanced way that looks at not just the wastewater, but also stormwater and septic systems and agriculture, all those sectors working together. And the last major point here is air pollution affects the Chesapeake Bay. And over the last several years, the Hogan administration and MDE in particular, using our Clean Air Act authorities, working with other agencies, Mr. Chairman, as you know, with transportation, clean transportation, zero emissions, reducing pollution from smokestacks and tailpipes, not just in Maryland, but upwind and upstream, are key to meeting our 2025 Chesapeake Bay restoration goals. Now, what I would like to do is turn to the questions and to my other colleagues. And I'm going to start with Secretary Hadaway-Riccio, and then I'll ask Rob McCord to make some brief remarks, and then we'll answer your 5 questions. Jeannie.
Great, thank you, Secretary Grumbles, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to share some Chesapeake Bay restoration highlights with you today. On behalf of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, we'd like to acknowledge that one of the best and most notable ways that we can engage citizens in Chesapeake Bay restoration and also inspire the next generation of stewards is through experiences that connect them with our natural resources. So we're really glad to report that all of our land conservation programs, including Program Open Space, for the 5th year in a row are fully funded in the governor's budget. And also included in the governor's budget is a Program Open Space repayment of $30.5 million, and which means ultimately that our administration has kept its promise to make those repayments, and we appreciate the General Assembly's support along the way. Another one of our budget highlights is the fact that it provides nearly $75 million for the Maryland Park Service, which is a 20-year high, and $750,000 for the newly formed Office of Outdoor Recreation. So to address our TMDL goals, it's of paramount importance that we continue to work together to conserve, protect, and restore our landscapes and our waterways. And the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays Trust Fund is one of Maryland's most effective resources in that effort. The structure of that grant process allows us to identify the most cost-effective projects with the highest pollution reduction outcomes. And over the coming year, we'll continue to incorporate resiliency in our restoration efforts to ensure that we continue progress and not lose progress over time. To date, through the trust fund, we have seen completion of over 3,000 projects, the development of 42 new restoration technologies, and innovative and public-private partnerships that have been established. We really, therefore, believe that the trust fund is an example for the entire nation of how state funding can be used and strategically targeted to make sure that we have measurable impacts. It is absolutely imperative that we retain the funding for the trust fund to meet our goals for 2025 and beyond. How do we know that? Monitoring of long-term data is helping us to measure that progress. Last but not least, I wanted to just acknowledge the important role that agriculture and local jurisdictions play in Chesapeake Bay restoration. So it's worth noting that the trust fund supports both Maryland farmers and Maryland communities with technical assistance and best management practices. We partner with all of our Bay Cabinet agencies to make that happen, including the Maryland Department of Planning, which is a great segue to Secretary McCord.
You're on mute, Mr. Secretary.
There you go. Common problem. Thank you, Secretary Riccio. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Planning continues to work on close examination of the census numbers that we received, including the population estimates going forward. We're also looking at the population of all the census tracts in the entire Conowingo watershed. Maryland and Virginia make up more than 70% of that. Maryland and Pennsylvania together make up about 51% of that. So we are keeping an eye on those population numbers and looking at the trends for growth. At planning, we also work on the ground with local governments, and we strive to help those local governments keep that development inside the priority funding areas. The population inside the priority funding areas is at about 85%, 85.1, just a little bit more than that. And generally, we see population changes in Maryland, of course, it increased by about 7%. But it's on a downward trend in about 7 of our counties. So we're keeping an eye on that also. The COVID pandemic has caused blips in the population. There's no doubt about that. And a lot of the demographers are writing papers now about not a baby boom, but a baby bust. And we have to keep an eye on that. There are people who have children later in life, people who have not the second child or the third child they thought they were going to have. And so there is this little blip in the curve about population growth based on the pandemic. And we're keeping an eye on that also. How much of an impact that's going to have 5 years from now when the children don't show up in schools is one question, but how much of an impact overall, we're trying to get our hands around that also. And we will also be trying to get the impact of migration and immigration. That still remains to be seen. We have a lot of what the numbers are, and we're delving into why the numbers are and trying to keep our ears open for what everybody is trying to propose as why the numbers are. So, but we will continue as the Department of Planning on the ground with local governments and in the State Data Center to be a resource for all the Bay Cabinet agencies. So I'll just turn it over back to Secretary Grumbles. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Mr. Chairman, what I'd like to do now is turn to Assistant Secretary Hans Schmidt on behalf of Secretary Bartenfelder to say a few words and to answer the first question as it relates to cover crops.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary and Mr. Chairman and committee members. It's a pleasure to be here. For the record, I'm Hans Schmidt, Assistant Secretary, Office of Resource Conservation here at the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Secretary Bartenfelder sends his regrets. He's hosting the Ambassador of Hungary today and couldn't be here. But he asked me to say a few words. First and foremost, the health of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries is a priority for MDA. The Maryland Department of Agriculture has adapted to the challenges that COVID has brought on in order to meet the commitment to achieving 2025 Chesapeake Bay water quality goals and climate resiliency. We are fortunate here in Maryland that we have some of the most progressive farmers in the country who lead with the use of nutrient management and conservation best management practices to protect water quality, reduce soil erosion, and improve soil health. However, it is important also to recognize that our Maryland farmers are scrutinized more than competing farmers in our neighboring states or across the country due to the regulatory requirements that exist. With this in mind, we must continue to support our local farmers to ensure viable and sustainable agriculture industry in Maryland. I'm happy to say that we are succeeding with those challenges. And despite COVID, the job market challenges, MDA administered 4 recruitments to fill 53 positions across the state for our soil conservation districts, providing the best customer service to our farmers and addressing resource concerns. Following 7 years of hard work and perseverance, the Maryland's Phosphorus Management Tool, or PMT regulations, were fully implemented on July 1st, 2021, as recommended by the PMT Advisory Committee. We continue to evaluate our programs to incentivize the adoption of additional conservation on agricultural lands. Last spring, Governor Hogan signed a new law that authorized the MAX, or our Maryland Cost Share Program, to provide up to 100% cost share for more than 20 priority conservation practices. Those practices will help us address the needs to reduce our nitrogen load to the bay. As a result of higher inflation, our Conservation Grants Program implemented temporary measures to account for the escalating material costs to provide farmers some relief. The Soil Health Advisory Committee just approved recommendations to the Secretary this past week, and we look forward to moving our commitment to broadening soil health and sustainability across our great state. And finally, we must ensure that we are addressing the needs of all our agricultural producers throughout the state, rural or urban alike, whether a half acre or 10,000 acres in size. We remain committed to assisting and helping farmers protect our environment while providing solutions to keep their farms strong and viable. And at this time, I would like to respond to the first question, the recommendation that the department address the possibility of an outcome-based payment system for the cover crop program. This was often talked about, as Andrew said, with the Soil Health Advisory Committee. And MDA is currently evaluating the existing cover crop program, including potential offerings of multi-year program changes to support soil health. MDA anticipates presenting multiple potential changes to the Cover Crop Technical Advisory Committee for their concurrence this spring. And at the same time, MDA is evaluating measurable soil health outcomes. In the meanwhile, MDA is working on developing a pay-for-performance pilot through our ag drainage filter practices. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, I would like to answer the other 4 questions now that were teed up for us. Question number 2 was about overall budget narratives being provided for the Bay Restoration funding effort. And so the answer is the administration will certainly continue to provide the requested data, including the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays 2010 Trust Fund Annual Report with the governor's fiscal 2024 allowance. Special shout out to DNR, Secretary Hadaway Riccio, Dave Goshorn, working closely with all of the Bay Cabinet agencies to put together comprehensive data. We will also continue to emphasize the importance of public-private partnerships and innovative financing, pay for performance. This is what was in the governor's letter to the Speaker and to the President of the Senate. The Conservation Financing Act is a very important measure that you can help move forward to supplement our funding and ensure durable, sustainable partnerships to achieve our environmental ambition for the Bay and serve as a model for other states. The second, it's actually question number 3 is about the spending report and the recommendations of DLS to comment on dealing with short-term impacts, different wastewater treatment plant failures, and also Conowingo Dam watershed implementation plan. We've provided the answer in writing, but I certainly want to say here and now verbally to share with members of the committee that we will certainly continue to provide requested data and information responsive to your requests. One of the most important things we can do, and which we are doing, is to ensure enforcement accountability for the two world-class treatment plants in Baltimore, Patapsco and Back River, that have over the last year fallen behind. There's a lack of certified operators. There's some serious maintenance issues. There's failure to meet our MDE permit limits. And that is why we have sued the city to ensure a judicially enforceable settlement agreement, a consent decree and schedule. That is a critical component to staying on track, which is what MDE and the state of Maryland are focused on doing. It's key. So we are in the litigation. We have the full support of the Attorney General. We're working closely with NGOs, particularly Blue Water Baltimore. That's a very important component, and we're committed to getting those facilities back on track. For the Conowingo, as you've heard several of us emphasize before, and the governor has focused on, it is like climate change. It's one of the key components of overall success and meeting our environmental commitments. And as it relates to the settlement and the FERC licensing agreement, FERC took the action of including the MDE settlement agreement with Exelon into that license. Right now, there's a lawsuit in federal court where some groups, environmental groups, are suing. They are challenging the FERC license and including components of it relating to the MDE settlement. So we're watching that and obviously want to stay engaged, because having Exelon put real money, first time ever enforceable commitments for a healthier river, for less pollution, for a lot of best management practices upstream, for pollution prevention, for increased climate resiliency is very important. But the other two components relate to the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan, a first ever agreement, interstate plan involving Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, with support from all the other Bay states and the federal government, to use a public-private partnership to come up with a more cost-effective way to supplement the phase 3 WIPs that all the state jurisdictions are doing to help reduce that 6 million pounds of nitrogen. The big news here is that while we agreed on the plan finally, and we have set up a mechanism for an innovative financing authority through the Susquehanna River Basin Commission to take public and private sector funds, state and federal, to put money into these pollution prevention measures upstream throughout the Conowingo watershed. The big news is that while other states were waiting to see what the other states would put in, or the federal government, Governor Hogan included in his budget $25 million. We're hoping that will prompt other states, particularly Pennsylvania, to match, and for the federal government, which we know is committed to meeting the goals of the Chesapeake Bay Restoration, to step up and more than match that $25 million. The other component, though, which also is integral to that, is the governor put $6 million for the Conowingo dredging project, the effort that MES is taking the lead on, coordinating closely with the Governor's Bay Cabinet and others, and that is to create the market for the clean, beneficial reuse of dredge material behind the dam. That has to be part of the solution, and so we continue to work on that front, Mr. Chairman. So that's where things are with respect to the Conowingo and the watershed implementation plan and the dredging. As it relates to the other question, and I just touched a button and deleted what the other question was, Mr. Chairman. Hold on for a second.
Dealing with the EPA, the lawsuits, and the Biden.
Oh, yes, thank you. Right now, we're beginning to get a sense of some momentum that EPA will be responsive to the requests of the states, Maryland in the lead, and the District of Columbia and Virginia and Delaware. The issue, members of the committee, is not just funding. The issue is what can we get from EPA where they commit to use regulatory backstops because Pennsylvania has clearly not developed a plan that they had committed to develop. So we're in those discussions in litigation, but we're in those discussions about insisting on regulatory backstops to hold Pennsylvania's feet to the fire to make sure agriculture and other sectors really step up. Pennsylvania, as Andrew Gray accurately stated, Pennsylvania has submitted a revised plan to EPA. EPA is reviewing it, and EPA is getting an earful from the states in the lawsuit to ensure that they know that we still see inadequacies in the revised plan. There's still a $324 million gap in funding. There are still shortfalls in meeting the commitments. This is why we're so supportive of regulatory backstops and innovative funding, interstate Conowingo WIP funding, and federal support, not just EPA, but other federal agencies to help reduce the threat of the lack of progress from Pennsylvania and New York and the Conowingo watershed and the Susquehanna River itself. Mr. Chairman, there was another question, I believe, and if you could help me on that. This was the last question.
It's just the recommended
Oh, yes.
language.
On the recommendation, we certainly accept the recommendation of, we look forward to always submitting the comprehensive funding plan for the Chesapeake Bay and doing so by December 1. We do respectfully object to the recommendation of withholding $1 million until we submit that plan. We don't see the need to do that. We have consistently submitted a plan on time and comprehensive, but we do want to say that we'll submit the plan, and we would prefer that you not withhold the $1 million upon submittal.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and to all your colleagues in the Governor's Bay Cabinet. I see at least one question. If my other colleagues have questions, please use your raise hand function. We'll start with Delegate Metzger. You have to unmute, Delegate.
There.
Try again.
Try it now. How's that? Is that better? Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Grumbles. It's always a delight to be with you and your team. But I need early on Back River Wastewater Treatment Center. I live about a mile from there. And when we heard all the rumbles about what was taking place, I immediately arranged a meeting, and my staff and we went there. And I got to honestly tell you, I felt as though as I was talking to them that they were smiling and saying everything was fine. But I've been around people long enough. I felt as though I was being lied to and smiled at the same time. I know that the governor has put nearly, I think, $62 or $63 million in upgrades. But when we got to talk, and they were saying, "Oh, there's no waste going into the Back River." Well, I have you to know we have worked very, very hard, and with Maryland Waterways and Back River Restoration to get our waterways in a clean spot. We was told not long ago our waterways is cleaner than the Severn River. With that said, after all the discussion, they said, well, it's shortage on staff, but we really don't have a problem with that. I go outside and I talk to staff people, and they were saying that they have no staff. Staff has been wavered. Then we got to the gist of things, and they said, well, truly, we're having problems with our pumps. We can't keep the pumps up. So could you address that, whether it's the pumps or was there a major problem? Is there something behind this? If there's a problem, let's fix the problem and move on. I know my community has been putting up with the, I hate to say this, the odor for some time, and it's getting worse. It's not getting better. So could you address that, please?
Yes, sir. We were outraged by our investigations. Our investigations, coupled with other investigations and insights from Blue Water Baltimore and other NGOs. But when we started to discover the extent of the problem, some of it was COVID related in terms of workforce, but some of it was a failure to operate and maintain these world-class facilities that received probably close to $1 billion over the years in state and federal funding. We know it takes a partnership to comply with Clean Water Act permits and responsibilities, that we have a role to help fund the infrastructure along with the federal government, but we're absolutely committed, and we filed the lawsuit because severe penalties and closer scrutiny need to happen. We've had some good meetings in terms of the city and the Department of Public Works stepping up their game, but we know this is significant. And I just want to close by saying we understand the frustration and we share the concern, and it is one of the top priorities for us in enforcing our clean water commitments to make sure that those facilities are meeting the permits and that the infrastructure is in place and upgraded, and that the city takes seriously its clean water responsibilities. And we'll work with them, but they have to make significant progress on that front.
Well, Secretary Grumbles, I appreciate that so very, very much. But will you explain, is it the pumps the problem with? There's nobody really tells the problem.
I mean, we identified 30 to 40 different problems. Some of them are reporting where they're not submitting their plans on fats, oils, and greases. The huge investment in the backflow, the hydraulic pumps problem, the headworks effort, that is a major step forward. But what I'm seeing is that there are a variety of challenges. So Delegate, I don't know how much of it is the pumps. They have contractors, they have a lot of money to put to fix the hydraulic backup problem. I think it's much more than pumps. It's not having the workforce in place to manage all the different components of these complex world-class facilities.
Well, Secretary Grumbles, I'll tell you, I give you my word. If you want to make a plan to go there, I will clear my schedule. We'll go there and we'll get to the bottom of this thing, because it's my constituents. They're at outrage. They're selling their homes and leaving the area. That's how bad it is.
I'm happy to visit the facility. I know our inspectors are visiting it frequently, and I've been there, but not in the last 6 months. So I'd be delighted to go and see what progress is being made. Thank you, sir.
You set it up. I'll be there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Metzger. Delegate Vitessel.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Grumbles, how you doing?
Good. Thank you.
I want to just follow up more on Delegate Metzger's question, and having worked in the wastewater arena for a lot of years. Blue Plains, as you mentioned, and Back River were the two world-class facilities that were designed and constructed and would put in $1 billion or more into. So looking at it and listening to some of the problems there, it appears to me, well, I have two questions. One, since it was a very, very complex operation, are there design flaws? Are there things that build into those facilities that make it very difficult for them to be operated, or both? Is it the operation and operators and the staff and the people and the management of those facilities that lead to these breakdowns? And I would like to follow that question up and then with with a, both of these facilities were under consent orders for a long time. And that basically allowed them to operate without fines and penalties and pollute while they were working on getting the facilities in place. Here in lowly Garrett County, whenever we have a pump station breaks down, we get fined, and so in all these little facilities, it seems like we get kind of not dumped on, but there's a lot of effort from MDE to make sure we maintain compliance. I just wonder if with these facilities and with the problems you're having getting them operating, with the problems to make sure that they are operating properly, are we going to do more in consent orders and allow them to continue to pollute while they come up with more consent orders to fix these problems? Or are you going to make sure that they do what's necessary to get these things into compliance?
Thank you, Delegate Vitessel. First of all, just clarification, you mentioned Blue Plains, that's the other
Right.
world-class facility in the district that also serves Marylanders and is a workhorse for the progress we've been making in Chesapeake Bay Restoration and Potomac River cleanup. So Back River and Patapsco, I think to answer your question, and there's some subjectivity to this, but I clearly see it not as a technological challenge, but as a management and funding challenge to make sure those facilities are run properly and the technologies that are achievable and have been funded are in place and being operated properly. And with increasing extreme weather, it's all the more important to be having capable staff operating the facilities, reducing the pollution coming into the facility, but more to the point, making sure that all the different aspects of a enhanced nutrient removal facility are in place, including the very expensive recent Headworks project to deal with that backflow hydraulics problem, which is excellent news and an excellent investment. I understand the frustration of other communities around the state who feel like they're often on the receiving end of MDE enforcement actions, when pound for pound, the really big facilities are where the most important progress is going to have to be made. And so we appreciate that. We are putting a lot of people, a lot of forces, including assistant attorneys general and our staff, to help ensure that the Department of Public Works in Baltimore puts much more effort and resources into these facilities. I wrote to the mayor suggesting months ago that millions of dollars being made available to the city through the American Rescue Plan could be devoted to helping fix the problems at Back River and Patapsco. It's their decision on which funds to use. Our enforcement actions, including our recently filed lawsuit, focus on making sure they put much more effort into running these facilities properly and paying penalties. And the last clarifying point I would just simply make is you're correct that they are under consent decrees, particularly to deal with sanitary sewer overflows and backup sewage in streets and basements. But by being in a consent decree doesn't mean they avoid penalties. There are stipulated penalties and pretty rigorous reporting and accountability provisions in those consent decrees. Our goal is to make sure that they aren't just putting money into financial penalties, but that they are putting money into the workforce needs they have to properly run these facilities.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Chairman, can I follow up with a question? I did mention Blue Plains instead of Papsico, but in Blue Plains, are there similar problems? Or do you see management problems there? Do you see that they're doing a better job managing their facilities in Baltimore, and is that lack of management in the at the Back River contributing to a lot of these problems?
I have not heard or looked closely at if Blue Plains has management issues. I'm sure they have challenges all the time. I'm very familiar with their board, their oversight. I'm just not aware of any similar challenges right now. That's a good thing. Maryland sends a lot of its wastewater from Prince George's and Montgomery County to Blue Plains. But I can't honestly say that I know if there are similar staffing issues. I just haven't heard of any.
All right, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Delegate Vitessel. Delegate Kittleman, your hand went down, but I think you had a question.
I did. It's a very blunt question, but Secretary, your experience with Baltimore City, this is the third or fourth major issue that seems to be beyond the city's capability to deal with. And have you seen anything that gives you the comfort that they actually will do what they have been tasked with?
If I did, we probably would not file the lawsuit. We need to file the lawsuit and have more oversight. And I mean, it has to be a partnership between the state and the city. We have a lot of federal monies invested in it as well. But I am hopeful. What I have seen is that they have been meeting on a fairly frequent basis now with our inspectors and our senior management. They know they have a problem, but we filed a lawsuit because we know we need to get much more control and scrutiny, judicially enforceable to hold their feet to the fire while also continuing to support their efforts and provide funding for a regional asset.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Kittleman. I'll also acknowledge the presence of the full committee Vice Chair Chang is with us. Mr. Secretary, this is somewhat adjacent to the issue, but obviously important for air pollution and water runoff is trees. Last year, I think it was last year, the legislature passed the Tree Solutions Now Act, which had I think sort of a mandated transfer of funds from the Bay Restoration Fund to the Bay Trust. And I just want to know, I think the money for that is in the budget as required, but I wasn't sure if the mechanics of that have been worked out yet, the timing and any other details you might be able to share with us.
I'm proud of the fact that all of the agencies are responding to the legislation. Secretary Hadaway Riccio of Natural Resources and Barton Felder of Agriculture. I chaired the first meeting of the new commission that's been set up to make sure there's a really smart, strong plan in place to meet the commitment. Our Hogan administration on our climate greenhouse gas reduction goal committed to 7 million trees being planted. The legislature said 5 million more, and have this tree planting commission and identify where to not just grow them, but to maintain them and support them. So I think we have the mechanisms in place. And Mr. Chairman, we have a strong support from the NGOs and the city of Baltimore and others to see this new law implemented successfully.
Okay, maybe we'll follow up with you about some of the mechanics of the transfer of the funds, because that's the question that's not entirely clear from the budget. My next question, or my other question, is about the $25 million for the upstream funds for BMP along the Susquehanna. You mentioned, hopefully this will incentivize Pennsylvania to match it, although I don't think it's contingent on that. Can you just talk about, how we're going to go about selecting the uses for these funds if it's approved in the budget?
Yes, sir. And thank you for asking that. And I want to assure every member of the committee that this is an exciting and innovative approach of true partnership with the other states and hopefully with the federal government. The way this would work is that right now, the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan has been approved. But we've been working and struggling over the last year and a half plus on how to come up with funding to get this innovative approach going. We have an agreement with the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, which is an interstate compact that could be a broker that could provide the funding for projects in the Susquehanna River watershed, and also manage the fund, the revolving fund, the incoming investments, not just from the states and federal government, but from the private sector. And so what our goal is to work with citizens of Maryland and with the other states on what are some of the priority types of projects. For us, we know that it will be best management practices, and some of those will be in Maryland above the dam, but others, a lot of them will be in Pennsylvania and in New York. They could be. What are the most effective basins? We envision that some of those projects for that 25 million will be for not only for restoration, wetlands and buffers to soak up the nutrient and sediment runoff from the land, but could also be for freshwater mussel hatcheries. That's a really innovative component of our commitment to get Exelon to provide significant funding into freshwater mussels. And some of that funding could also go for beneficial reuse of dredged material, for tree plantings. It's still not decided what the specific projects would be. The bold step forward is to say Maryland is looking at the health of the overall Chesapeake Bay and the need for holistic solutions, and we'll put our money where our mouth is and hope others will match. And I think a big part of that funding is going to help increase the resiliency of the Susquehanna by reducing runoff through best restoration projects like the resiliency through restoration program that Department of Natural Resources has and has been successfully implementing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate all that. Obviously, we always need to be careful with taxpayer dollars, and the GO bonds are still amount to taxpayer dollars. It gets particularly sensitive when that money is going sort of directly out of state. So I recognize the downstream benefit and obviously the benefits to the Bay and the overall watershed. I just think we need to walk a little bit carefully when we're talking about spending money on projects in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
When we also think Pennsylvania has an obligation to sort of do their own work here. And I know your suits with the EPA are partly driven at that.
Right. We can, as Senator Cardin has acknowledged, sometimes dollars, whether it's Maryland dollars or dollars from other downstream states that are invested in Pennsylvania and with the private sector, that can be a great investment where we get more bang for our buck. But of course, we want to make sure that Pennsylvania is accountable, that those projects would be carried out, and that Pennsylvania closes the gap on its own state phase 3 WIP. So that's what the litigation is all about. And that's a critical step we need to get that matter behind us, coupled with the innovative strategies for the Conowingo Watershed Implementation Plan.
Great. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Last call. Okay, well, let me thank all the departments. Obviously, we'll be seeing each of you for your individual budget hearings, but appreciate you all being here today. I'll just remind my colleagues that the subcommittee will next meet on Wednesday for the Maryland Department of Transportation budget overview, and that analysis is already available if you need some reading tonight. Ken, did I miss anything?
No, you did not. You got it all covered.
Great. Well, thank you all again. And I think with that, we are adjourned. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.